Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Mythgard Movie Club. We are here today to talk about Blade Runner, in case the big picture of Han Solo there, or I mean, Richard Deckard wasn't a clue. So before we get into the discussion, just a few announcements as usual. For those who don't know, we've got 4 new regional moots coming this year, and 2 of them, as of this afternoon, actually have real live information on the Signum website that you can go out and check and even register for them. Sunshine Moot, which is coming up in March, is pretty quick. February is like in a few hours. So we're going to be coming up on Sunshine Moot here pretty quick. The call for papers is out there, the registration link, and they have some fun post moot and pre-moot activities that people can participate in as well if you're interested in that sort of thing. One of them may or may not be at the Wizarding World of Harry Potter. So if you're interested in that, then maybe go check that out. And then Nethermoot, our first continental Europe moot, is there's some information out there that's in April, on April 13th, and it's got its own website, lots of good stuff up there for people to go check out as well. I don't know if Minute Moot is actually the affirmed name of the Massachusetts Moot, but that one's still kind of being worked on for the fall. And Kiwi Moot, those are both still tentative as far as dates and all of that goes, but we'll share information about those as we have it. And of course, the big news is our annual gathering, Myth Moot, in June. Has been announced. Registration is open. It's currently early bird pricing. So if you want to go out there to signumuniversity.org/mythmoot, you can get the details on the pricing and all of that. There's still a lot of work to be done. We have one of our special guests confirmed, Diana Glyer, who is the company they, what's the name of her book?
The company.
Did I get that? The company they keep. Okay. I had like a brain thing going on there. I couldn't remember the second half of that, but anyway, so lots of good information there. You can go out, register for Mythmoot if you want, and then we've got our I don't think registration is quite open yet for our summer classes, but it's getting there. It will be soon. We just ended registration for the spring classes, and I know the forms are being set up for the registration for our new summer classes. Which, if you'll notice, in the list here, we've got 4 great classes, one of which is brand new on the Inklings in King Arthur. You may have heard of a book of a similar name. I wonder where that came from. Yeah, so that will be a really interesting one. The course isn't just looking at the book, obviously. It's actually looking at the whole King Arthur tradition and kind of how the Inklings took it and transformed stuff and adapted it to their own stories. Of course, there will be parts from the book edited by our own Serena Higgins, which will be included as part of that class. But it goes much more in depth into a lot of the King Arthur tradition and things and stuff. The Force of Star Wars. We've got a new Star Wars movie coming out this year, so good time to kind of pull from the vault and bring back the Force of Star Wars. Dr. Sturgis's great class there. I took it. I think, Don, you took it, right? Like, I definitely recommend it.
Same time, I think.
Beyond Middle-earth, of course, by Dr. Olson, Corey, the Tolkien professor, of course, with some stuff in there from Tom Shippey, so a great sort of exploration of Tolkien's Middle-earth. And then Beowulf in Old English for all of you who have taken the introduction to Anglo-Saxon. This is sort of the, quintessential next step, right, is to do a workshop in Old English and Beowulf. I mean, what else would you start reading, right? I know there's a lot of stuff you could start reading in Old English, but still, it's a good place to begin. All right.
So we just wanted to make sure you guys know the next sessions in the movie club. We're still finalizing the schedule for the full year. So TBD for, the kind of spring and summer and fall slots. We haven't quite figured out what order we're doing things in. But next, we're definitely going to do the follow-up to Blade Runner, which is Blade Runner 2049. Disclaimer, we're probably going to table a few topics that we might have covered in this movie club for the next session. things about like where the story would go from here, some speculation that might have been had that gets answered or not answered in the following film. I just feel like that's going to be better if we kind of hold that off. So if you have questions related to that, either save them or else, send them to us now and we'll kind of put that on the docket for next time. And then after that is going to be a new film called Captive State, which we know very little about, except that it's sci-fi and stars John Goodman. And that actually is released in theaters on March 15th. So go see that in the theater if you can, and then meet us on April 18th to talk about it.
And there's actually 2 trailers out for that, so you can go watch that.
2 whole trailers, so it sounds like it's happening.
It's like legit.
It's actually a movie that's actually coming out to theaters. That was one of the ones we meant to talk about last year, and it got pushed back. So I'm excited that that's actually coming out. So we just want to introduce ourselves really quickly as usual. I'm Kat Sass. I work at the University of Pennsylvania and volunteer for Signum and Mythgard. Curtis and I host a podcast called Kat and Kurt's TV Review, and I sometimes, when I have the time, blog at ravingsanity.wordpress.com.
Dom?
Oh, sure. I can go next. Dominic Nardi. I'm a political scientist by day. Also, sometimes Signum student. I sometimes blog and tweet at Nardi Views, my last name, and then Views. Currently, one of my big projects is I'm trying to co-edit a book about Dune, where I'm collecting scholarship, various articles about Frank Herbert's Dune saga. We're still accepting papers, so a bit of a plug here. Look for our call for papers online, and if you're interested, please submit something.
And I'm Chris Swank. I have been a Signum student, a Signum graduate, a Signum preceptor, a Signum thesis director, and I've been there from day one. And I'm currently working on my PhD with Dr. Dimitri Fimi, who's one of our faculty. And gosh, the first time I saw Blade Runner, I was working at a small local theater in the summer of 1982. And there was one screen and it played every night. And as soon as all the candy was sold and everybody went to sit down, my boss let me go stand in the back of the theater and I watched every night. I watched this movie. I've probably seen this movie more than any other movie besides maybe Holy Grail.
How many times do you think you saw it in the theater?
Oh, well, that first run, I think we had it for 2 weeks. So, maybe up to 14 times. And then periodically since then, VHS, DVD, Blu-ray, all that good stuff.
Just a bit of a plug here. If you have not seen Blade Runner in 4K, you really should. It's an excuse to buy a 4K TV.
There you go. All right, and I'm Curtis Wyant. As Kat mentioned, we have a podcast, Kat and Kurt's TV Review, where we talk about sci-fi and fantasy shows. I also am a Signum graduate. A couple of years ago now. Wow, it's 2 years. It's been. I do some other writing and stuff. Laser Fillet is another of my projects, and do some writing at my own blog, curtiswine.com. So feel free to check that out, or not, whatever you want to do. Let's move into our discussion. So we've had a few movie discussions that we've talked about that were adaptations of books. This I don't know, this one feels a little different to me. Maybe just because while there are obviously a lot of differences, I think the tone and the feel is very much more similar, I think, than maybe some of the others that we looked at between the book and the movie. But yeah, we just kind of wanted to start. I think everyone here on the panel has read now, as of this afternoon, Kat included, has read
as of about an hour ago.
to Android's Stream of Electric Sheep. But yeah, kind of what are your initial thoughts here about the adaptation, the source material, anything that you want to start with there. And I'll throw it to Dom and Chris if you guys want to start and just kind of give your thoughts there.
Sure. Well, maybe I can start just by giving some context for the book, because I think that ties into the movie as well. So Philip K. Dick, the author who wrote Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, one of his inspirations for the book, as well as for his other books like The Man in the High Castle, was that he read a diary of an SS officer, and this SS officer was complaining about how he couldn't get to sleep at night because the screams of the children who were in the concentration camps were just too loud and were keeping him up at night. And like a normal human being, Philip K. Dick's response was, "Wow, this guy does not have any empathy. What's wrong with him?" And that began a fascination on Dick's part with just the question of empathy. Why do some people lack empathy? What is empathy? What does it mean to see somebody else as human? Man in the High Castle was a bit more direct in that it's literally an alternate history of what if the Nazis won World War II. But Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep is also very much an inquiry into that question, into empathy, into who has it, why. And it's for that reason that I think Blade Runner is actually an adaptation of the book. Despite all the differences, despite the differences in tone, and the book has this whole subplot about this religion and this reality TV show that's just excised from the movie. But despite all that, the movie is still interested in that same fundamental question. So, and I actually think in some interesting ways, maybe that we'll get into this later, but I think the movie and the book come to slightly different conclusions about empathy, but they're still asking the same what if question. So it's not like I, Robot, the movie, which has nothing to do with Isaac Asimov's stories. So
Yeah, and knowing that explains some of the things in the movie that are a little bit obscure, like why do they need to look at somebody's eyeball when they're trying to figure out if they're a human or a replicant? And it has to do with, the questions they ask. You turn this tortoise over and it can't turn itself back, and it's baking in the sun. And they're trying to see this instinctive response, that most people have to stress in the eyeball and that a replicant might not have. And all of the issues with having fake animals versus real animals, and nobody can afford them, it becomes kind of an economic question in the movie. But in the book, it's really a question about if you can have pets, you can show empathy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting too. And I don't know the history of, sort of the science behind looking at like decision making and that kind of thing. But I know there have been studies done where, there's patterns, they'll do like a fMRI of a brain scan showing like activity in your brain where, a decision has been made by your brain before you're even like conscious of it. And those types of things where, it's obviously sort of captured in the book and maybe sort of implicitly, like you were saying, Chris, in the movie where they're doing these retinal scans and kind of that same idea of like how, what's the reaction time from when you hear a question to when you're, feeling empathy or when you're physiologically responding to empathy, I guess, and that kind of thing. But it's really interesting how that plays out just in sort of the real world science of, I know decision making is a different thing, but that same idea of like, the feelings in the brain process versus the physiological response and all of that. And, how close can we get in, AI to mimicking that or actually copying it? And then, what's sort of that point of, the turning point of, when does AI become life? I feel like that's the question that the book and the movie both sort of play around with is, if you can't tell a difference between the two, then, is the AI, are the androids actually alive or are they not? And all of the animals too, because like that's the big thing, right? Is like in the book, I think it plays a little more close to the vest of whether or not the animals are robotic or not. And then in the movie, you kind of find out like right away that like the owl is actually a electric owl, but there's that idea of like, okay, well, in this world where all the animals are extinct or nearly all of them, then, does creating animals that are close enough, so close that you can't tell the difference between them, is that the same thing or is it not?
Or are you just trying to show your neighbors how empathetic you are because you know the sheep is electronic, but all your neighbors think it's real, so you must be a cool dude because you have a real sheep.
Sure. And it gets to that idea of like, can you, to put it very non-academically, can you fake it till you make it? Like, is there a value to, faking empathy, which is kind of a reversal, right? If you're faking empathy, is that really empathy if people think it's empathy? And there's kind of layers there too to the whole android thing.
Mm-hmm. I like the use of animals works with that too, because of the associations of like this, and this gets us into the kind of, is empathy the thing that makes us human? Like the whole associations with psychopathy and everything of oftentimes cruelty to animals is a red flag for certain personality disorders and things like that. So the idea that, we've like you said, in a world where animals are going extinct, we've elevated the animal to this all important, litmus test of whether or not you value life other than your own. And that kind of makes some bit of sense. So even like, and in terms of adaptation, I think what this movie does really well is kind of take things that are spoken about at a certain length in the book and sort of translate them into plot and visual details, so that the ideas are there. They're just presented as more the backdrop rather than, kind of speechified about. So things like Rachael kind of walking around in a big fur coat, like that's, I don't think I ever registered that when I had seen just the movie the first time, but now after reading the book and then, kind of going back to the movie, you don't really need to comment on it. Suddenly that strikes me in a very different way. Like I wonder, is that real fur? Is it fake fur? Yeah. What is that supposed to say? Even if it is fake, what's the status symbol that she's kind of trying to, give and everything. So it's a really interesting way to adapt those ideas.
Well, and there's lots of little things like that, right? Because he has like a little, a snake scale or something, right? That he's like trying to figure out where it comes from. And it's like, when you add that layer of empathy, and animals to it, which isn't, again, it's never really explicitly talked about in the movie, or at least certainly not at length as it is in the book. Right. Then, definitely adds another layer to it. Nick Palazzo asks, is this something like someone buying a Prius to show their friends how concerned they are about the environment? I mean,
there's something performative about it. Yeah.
I don't think PKD. I don't think the term virtue signaling was popular back then, but I do think there's an element of that for sure.
I think the thing I find really fascinating about the movie and the book, and that they do this in different ways. Empathy. I think the humans in the society correctly identify empathy as an important part of the human experience, but it's become a sort of a status symbol. And the book and the movie, in different ways, try to turn that on the reader or the viewer and say, are you really as empathetic as you think you are? In the book, sure. In the book, the replicants are called androids, by the way. In the book, the androids will sometimes engage. They will sometimes try to hurt animals. There's a scene where several of the androids are pulling legs off a spider, and one of the few empathetic human characters in the book is horrified at this, and the reader shares that horror. But then in real life, and I think in the book, the book is trying to trick you into thinking, well, these androids are not human because they are doing this to the spider. Yet, if you take a step back, we know that there are plenty of humans who abuse animals. Plenty of kids who probably have smushed an ant without thinking twice about it. are they not human? Like, are we as humans not extending that empathy to animal? And what does that say about us? And the movie does it slightly differently, I think, and that all the humans in the movie are pretty dulled emotionally. Deckard doesn't seem to care about anything in his life. Bryant is all about sending this Blade Runner out to kill replicants. Meanwhile, the replicants are full of passion. They care about each other. Roy Batty is romantically involved with Pris, and they're kissing, and Zora is just like full of sexuality and life. But the humans are all just doing their job, living day by day. So it's kind of an interesting twist on the humans are trying to signal their humanity through empathy, but they're often not acting as human as the replicants are.
But Zora's relationship with the snake, I find really fascinating. She has this snake, so in that world, it's supposed to signal that she can be empathetic. She has this pet, but she makes love to it on the stage, basically. And is that animal abuse? And there's a whole bunch of humans sitting in the audience, like that's their entertainment, is watching the woman with the passionate snake. And I had the subtitles on this time while I was listening to the Ridley Scott commentary. And yeah, they're pretty out there saying that she's just up on the stage having fun with the snake. So very complicated relationship. It's complicated.
That's their Facebook status. It's complicated.
Yeah. So I don't know. One of the things that the film is widely praised, acknowledged, is sort of from the visual, like the influence of, and I think that's what this slide is getting at. Forgive me if I get the slides wrong, because I didn't put a lot of this one together. But just the visual aesthetic of the film itself, and kind of early '80s, like the graphics hold up pretty darn good. And I have not seen it in 4K, but I'm assuming by Dom's comments earlier that that it holds up even better under that higher definition and all of that, which is really interesting, because there aren't a lot of films from the early '80s that do hold up in that sort of way.
I'll just make just if we're talking about the aesthetics, maybe you should also mention that there have been different versions of the film. So we're talking about the 2007 final cut, which does not have their voiceover narration, but the final cut also has a few very small tweaks to the special effects. So there's a police car that rises in one scene, and they just digitally removed the cable that was attaching the car to the crane. So I don't know if it would hold up in 4K. I don't know if the original would hold up in 4K, but the 2007 final cut does.
Okay, and that's fair enough. Yeah, and I don't know enough about the technical workings of that sort of like remaster that maybe that's a lot of what we're seeing now, but it certainly did influence the look of plenty of other films to come later, some of which we may or may not talk about in Movie Club at some point or another. But yeah, I don't know if anyone has anything particular to say about the look and feel. It's just one of those things that's commonly sort of talked about when you talk about when people talk about the film from a visual aesthetics point of view.
Yeah, I can send the link around. Dom shared with us a YouTube, just short, like 10-minute, YouTube video about the influence, for good or ill, of at least on a visual level, of Blade Runner. And when you start thinking about it, it is kind of unbelievable the debt that everything, you know, futuristic dystopian sci-fi owes to this movie since then. There's a funny moment in the video where the guy's like, I'm not just going to rag on Altered Carbon, but then he goes on to like use Altered Carbon as the example for all the rest of his things. And it's hardly the only offender, but you kind of realize that, you know, this kind of dark, rainy, you know, noir aesthetic with very, you know, Tokyo kind of, you know, Asian characters everywhere, huge kind of Times Square advertisements and billboards, the seedy underbelly of, you know, kind of sex workers and homeless people, and, you know, and then the kind of noir detective working his way through it, how much that has become the kind of standard, you know, to the extent that it's hard to think of things in this genre that don't go for that visual look. So it's pretty amazing the impact that this movie had. And all of that's from the movie. I mean, I feel like the book, having just finished it an hour ago, is not intensely descriptive of, you know, the visual world. You kind of get a sense of the dystopia after this cataclysmic war and the dust. And, you know, there's certain kind of visual things that come across, but I don't feel like this film is stepped out of the pages of the book in terms of how it looks. You know, you really have to go to the film designers, I think, to find the roots of, and their, you know, their sources being things in other comic books and other science fiction artwork and everything. It's not so much from Philip K. Dick himself.
There were no noticeable lead cod pieces.
No, to protect you from the radiation. I think Dick had this term, and is it like kibbling or something, where
Kibble.
Yeah, kibble.
Yeah, kibble, where everything
Like
is falling apart, and you see that in some of the buildings, like where Sebastian lives in the movie. It's falling apart. Its pipes are breaking, like my pipes are breaking in my house. It's been a fun week. But they don't really talk about these giant advertisements and all the light, all the sources of light, and fires shooting up in the middle of town. Yeah, it's definitely, the film is its own beast.
For what it's worth, Philip K. Dick unfortunately passed away before the movie was finished, but he was shown just a rough cut of some of the special effects, some of the setting, and he was initially very skeptical about the film. But when he saw that montage of footage, he said, "Wow, you guys just reached into my mind and pulled the images out of my head." So yeah, I agree with Kat. The book itself does not contain that description, but Philip K. Dick approved, which is great. And yeah, the film aesthetics are just so iconic, and I think it's because the mood. It's not, you know, it's not even just the look; it's how that look makes you feel. You know, the way that Deckard just leans over on his porch and looks at the city. It really gives you that sense of loneliness and being around millions of people but feeling all alone. The advertisements feel oppressive. They feel like they're in your face. And that's something, and this YouTube video I sent around touches upon this. It's something that a lot of other films have copied the aesthetic of Blade Runner. I don't think they've always captured the mood of Blade Runner, though. I don't think they've always understood what that aesthetic is supposed to make you feel. And that's something where I think even if you turn the voice and the sound, I don't turn off the music. The music's important, but even if you turn off the dialogue for this film, it's the mood, the visuals tell the story. You would feel what you're supposed to be feeling at each point in the movie.
I think the person who captured that best was William Gibson in his Neuromancer books.
Sure.
That came out just like a year after this or so. His descriptions, 2 years. His descriptions of the cities and how you've got all these young kids living in the cities, but really jacked in to their computers inside their apartments and never leaving. And the way they travel is through the did he call it the Matrix? I can't remember what he called it, but the World Wide Web wasn't in existence then. But yeah, the net.
Yeah.
And so I think in terms of mood and how it makes you feel, I think Gibson and some of the cyberpunk authors are closer than other movies.
Well, William Gibson saw this movie and he was like, I don't know if I can write my own book now because they've done all my ideas. And of course, he wrote the book and it did well, but they're obviously very close.
Yeah, it is interesting that it's not a cyberpunk movie as we would think of it now, but it certainly had that influence on the cyberpunk genre. Going back to the loneliness aspect, the thing that I kept thinking when I was rereading the book, between that and the film, the loneliness in the book is in a lot of ways a loneliness of abandonment, because of the war and the dust, and the reason that people are moving off world is to get away from that, right? And the only ones who stay are like people who don't pass like certain tests, whether it's an IQ test or a health test or some kind of that, or for some reason they're aberrant and just want to stay, and whether it's an attachment to Earth or whatever. But you get the sense of like there's this emptiness, like in the apartment building, where it's like one person's living there, and when someone else moves in, it's like a big deal. There's like two people now living in this apartment building, and the loneliness, though, in the film is very different in a sense, in that it's a loneliness among the crowd. Like, because even just looking at like the picture here, like assuming that all the lights represent, apartments that have people in them, like, and even just, in shots of like the street and whatever, there's lots of people around, but it's that loneliness in the crowd that's kind of the different thing. And maybe ultimately, I mean, there's still types of loneliness, like it's not that different, but that would kind of be one difference too that I would call out between the two, because you get the sense of idea that the off-world, you don't really get an explanation of why people are going off-world in the film, right? It's like advertisements of like, go off-world. There are things out there to see and do, and maybe new places to live, but there's not, it doesn't have the same like catastrophic, reason for moving away to, try to save, humanity and, your own life and that kind of thing, that the book has.
On the other hand,
different.
Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
On the other hand, you're never alone, and that's why I put this slide together as I did. There's another YouTube video of all the eyeballs in this movie. And Scott was saying in the director commentary that it's the Orwellian eye. This eye in the lower part of the screen, we'd never really know whose eye that is.
I was going to ask.
Beginning of the movie. We don't know.
Whose eye is it? Yeah.
He says it's Big Brother. It's the corporations, the society, the government, which was a concern of Dick's as well. But there's a lot of eyeballs in this movie, so even though you might feel lonely, you're always being watched by this giant Japanese woman that's trying to sell you gum or whatever it is she's eating.
Right, and that's another way that it's the adaptation is, rather than literal, it's visual, that we're going to get at this theme through the details that are sort of ever present in the background rather than directly in plot or dialogue. And I think the eyeballs gets back to that question of empathy and identity. It's about your perspective on the world, but also seeing, empathy, I think, is imagining something from somebody else's perspective. And, back to what Dom was saying about how it's, as much as the humans, at least, the replicants have this idea of, if you could see what I've seen with your eyes, if you could imagine the world through, walk a mile in my shoes, that would sort of make a difference.
I do think so. I take Curtis's point, like in the difference between the book and the movie. I do think though there's an interesting wrinkle in the book, in that, so in the book there's this religion where people basically connect to some online network to try to share empathetic feelings towards this Christ figure. It's very complicated. I don't want to go into the details, but
Mercerism.
Mercerism, yeah. So I always read that as a kind of loneliness in the crowd, though, because you have a bunch of people presumably connecting from all over the world, trying to make a human connection rather than connecting in person with the people possibly right next door or in their neighborhood. There are characters in the book.
2019.
Pretty much. That's where I was going. Like, this is both the book and the movie feel very relevant to 2019. By the way, the movie's supposed to take place in 2019,
Right.
and obviously it doesn't look like 2019. But in terms of how 2019 sometimes feels, living in 2019, that sense of detachment, the sense that a lot of our connections are remote or distant. Like there have been surveys done, and the number of people, friends are disappearing. Like the number of people who actually spend time in person with friends has decreased precipitously in the past few decades. Like people just don't visit friends anymore in person. And I think so in a way, like I kind of feel like the book and the movie both capture that aspect of how life has changed since the 80s.
Yeah, Nick asks, he says, I wonder if anyone had a concept at the time as to how pervasive and invasive internet advertising would be. And it's like, well, no, how could they if there was no internet?
Well,
then I think that
at the military, but not.
Yeah.
But then I think
got my
first is that there were things going on at the time that were related to that. There must have been, there's some, even if it wasn't the internet as we know it, there must have been the roots of something that we're experiencing that 30 years ago were clearly on people's minds.
I don't know about 82. I had just gotten my first personal computer that spring, about the time, a couple months before this movie came out. And I'm trying to think if we had chat rooms at that point, or if that came a little bit later, but the personal computer was just getting into people's homes at this point. Mine was a TRS-80, by the way.
Yeah, and, well, I mean, I think, the visual here of like the huge, Times Square kind of billboard, digital billboard is, I mean, that's certainly pervasive. I mean, so the other thing I always think of, in sort of talking about advertising and how pervasive it gets is Minority Report, which of course is a much later film in terms of, coming after this is, but in terms of the story itself, also a Philip K. Dick story, but that scene where Tom Cruise walks into the store and it's just bombarded with like all of these advertisements and that kind of thing. Yeah, I mean, I think certainly maybe in the specifics, they wouldn't have known like, oh, you go onto this computer and there's a screen and then there's these ad pop-ups. But I think given PKD's interest in sort of corporatism and advertising and the ways that those sorts of things can be used and manipulated by whether it's a large company or a government or kind of a blending of the two, I certainly think those were the types of things he's thinking about. And maybe not the specific like internet advertising, but I think the invasiveness of advertising, and if people can figure out a way to, target better who they're advertising and what they're advertising to them, that certainly I'm sure was on his mind at various points. It definitely seems, just even thinking about, so, another aspect of the movie that they don't have is sort of the mood dials. But I remember, in rereading the book, like just thinking about like how much he thought about like what every little, there was like 1,000 or more, like little, no, he's like, oh, dial it to 582 and it means this. And it's like this very specific mood that you're, that would help you feel and that kind of thing. So
Prozac, Adderall, with it's
yeah.
in a different way, that's coming true.
There's it's interesting, like thinking about in the movie, like you're saying like Deckard feels, he's obviously very alone in a lot of this movie. I'm thinking of like, the point where he like passes out on the bed and it's just kind of like, laying there, and it's like, if only he had his little mood dial that he could dial himself happy for a bit, but they didn't bring that into the film. So, I don't know. I wasn't really necessarily going anywhere with that mood dial thing.
Well, it's interesting, tying some of our conversation together, that the only people in this movie that have friends are the replicants.
Yeah.
Sebastian doesn't, Deckard doesn't, his boss doesn't seem like the kind of guy who has friends. Gaff just kind of haunts the background all the time. All the humans are very much alone, and the replicants really look out for each other and travel together, and
Well, and they make that even more so from the book, where they take away Deckard's wife, and the Sebastian character in the book doesn't have friends exactly, but he at least interacts with other human beings. He's not completely alone. There's like, a bit about his job and his bosses and everything. So they make them even more isolated in the movie.
I mean, I'd add one caveat. Sebastian in the movie seems to be friends with Tyrell, and he's playing that chess game, but that's very much an online friendship, which very much feels like a real world 2019 thing. Sure. And yeah, I agree with Curtis that I don't think there was any specific prediction about the internet or technology in this movie, but I think because the movie is about humanity and empathy, I think that's why it captures all of this so well. And that's, look at our political debates today about social media. One of the things we're talking about is social media making us less empathetic towards other people? Are we, this is part of why we have like trolling of, people going online and attacking other people that they don't even know. And, I think the movie is kind of getting at some of those issues and saying, there's human empathy is something that we can't just assume, and maybe it requires work, and maybe it requires in-person relationships to some extent. So otherwise we just view the person on Twitter as some sort of replicant, that they're not human. They're just a at screen name or whatever.
So should we jump to the Rachael slide, because we can talk about love in cyber future?
Love in the cyber age.
So yeah, I mean their relationship is very violent. It's not traditional, and they don't even seem to really like one another very much. And this is the great love story of the. Well, I don't think it's the great love story. I think Roy and Pris is the great love story of this movie. But
yeah, I think this gets at an important question that I view as linked to the Rachael question, which is, who is the hero of this movie? If anybody. And I remember, I want to say about 15, 20 years ago, I'd first come across concerns about this scene when Deckard seems to force himself onto Rachael, and I wasn't sure what to think for a few minutes, and then it dawned on me that like Deckard's not the hero in this movie. The movie has never really said Deckard is a quote unquote good guy. He's not a role model, and in a lot of ways, Roy Batty fits the hero role that we would traditionally expect to see in the movie. He's the guy who is on a quest to achieve something that he believes is good, longer life. He's out there trying to right some wrong, and he's the guy fleeing the brutal cops. And in this movie, Deckard the cop, is pretty brutal and heartless. So he's the guy who's evading the corrupt authorities, trying to get what he believes is his right. Like Roy Batty, in a lot of ways, this is almost his story, and I think kind of seeing it from that perspective also put the Rachel Deckard romance in context. I don't think it's supposed to be a great love story. I don't think Deckard at this point in his arc is supposed to be a Romeo. He's a very flawed, very damaged human being who has trouble with empathy. By the end of the movie, I think he finally gets it. Like, I don't think end of this movie going forward, I don't think he would treat Rachel like that. But at this point in the movie, we're supposed to be somewhat taken aback by what he's doing.
Yeah, and I guess I guess you could argue that he gets there in the end, but I don't get the same sense of internal struggle from him even throughout, to the extent that there is in the book version of him either. Like, I think a few times people, question things, like, Rachel kind of questions, have you ever taken the empathy test? And have you ever retired a human being? Like, these are the same sorts of questions that get asked in the book, but I don't necessarily get the sense that Deckard is struggling with those questions himself. It's more like the questions are being asked of him. And these are things that he's sort of not put a lot of thought into, or sort of taking for granted.
I think there are a few very subtle moments when we see Deckard's confidence begin to waver. And the biggest one for me is when he shoots Zora in the back. When she's dead, when the other police officer is checking on her, he looks visibly shaken. He doesn't say anything indicating, he doesn't. It's but just Ford's performance. He's not. This isn't a victory, and the music and everything else in the movie reinforces that. And then he goes home. He looks battered. He's tired. So I think from that point on, and then of course the end of the movie, there's the whole scene with Roy Batty and Tears in the Rain. Part of my interpretation is also informed by the original theatrical cut had a voiceover narration that Harrison Ford did, which is not subtle. The movie, I think, says everything it needs to say, but the voiceover narration has Harrison Ford saying, "At that moment, I learned what it meant to be human." Blah blah blah. So, I think it's supposed to be there. It's
right.
Yeah. Well, so Nick is saying, internal monologue is easier to do in books, but maybe that's the piece that not having the voiceover or that the voiceover added and then was sort of taken out is not that it was necessarily good to have the voiceover. Maybe it was a little too, like you're saying, hitting you over the head with it, but maybe even attempting that in a film is just not the right medium to do that.
But I mean, in terms of Roy as the hero, I mean, I think if the sequence of things matters, he is the one that gets the big heroic choice at the end, and the sacrifice, and the empathetic, merciful choice too. So the movie sort of culminates in that decision of his, which is that's a good indicator of that we're supposed to be sort of looking at him more closely at the end.
Yeah, he's Luke Skywalker forgiving and redeeming Darth Vader.
Mm-hmm.
So
what do we make of oh, sorry, Chris, go ahead.
No, he's got that great speech at the end where, what he's seen the attack ships off Orion, and he's seen the C-beams at the Tannhauser Gate, and all of those moments are going to be lost when he dies. That's just the quintessential scene from this movie, and it's not Harrison Ford that gets it.
Mm-hmm. And we have Rutger Hauer to thank for it.
By which you mean that Rutger Hauer actually heavily rewrote that speech. That is his words, and also the dove was his idea. Holding the dove while jumping across the building. Makes
And
no
then
sense, but it works.
No, but when he dies, and he releases it when he dies, visually, it's very Christian imagery of a bird flying, the soul flying to heaven.
Mm.
And you think that Roy Batty's soul has been released. And that's kind of weird because he's a replicant.
Right. And his hand is pierced by a nail as well.
Exactly.
There's a lot of Christ imagery around that.
Mm-hmm.
And even doesn't he say, doesn't Gaff say, like, are you done? And Deckard says, it is finished. Like, there's so much kind of, biblical weight to Roy's ending there.
Mm-hmm.
So what do we make of Le Guin's quote then about there are no heroics, but there are heroes? Do you think, now she's talking about the books there, is that, I don't disagree that Deckard has an arc, that he's not a complete, static character necessarily, but do you think that, translating that arc into sort of visual terms and just through the performance reaches the same level as what's in the book, or do you think there's a reduction of his heroism in the translation there?
I don't love the term hero in this context. I don't think this is a work about heroes. I guess I hate to say this, but maybe I disagree with Le Guin. And this is true for a lot of cyberpunk as well. And I wouldn't say he's an anti-hero. He's a flawed individual, and maybe there's some heroism in overcoming prejudice. So I guess maybe I'd rephrase that to say there are no heroics, like no dashing, swashbuckling, save the princess type heroics, but there's like the small everyday heroism of becoming a better person.
I think that's what she means, and she's talking about P.K. Dick's books in general. If you look at The Man in the High Castle, you get a lot of people that are doing just small things to make other people's lives better. And what's another one of his? That same kind of thing. There's Gaff in this movie does the small heroic thing of letting Rachael go, and there's not some big standoff between Gaff and Harrison Ford as to go, you're not going to kill her. There's not a big melodramatic heroism. It's all very small and quiet, I think, is what she was kind of getting to.
And I haven't read this, although I do have Language of the Night, so I probably should read this piece that she wrote. But I would suspect too, because a lot of what Le Guin does is responding to sort of like the sort of golden age science fiction stuff, where you do have like the hero, that sort of like going from even the earlier tradition of like adventure hero stories, and which science fiction just sort of adopted wholesale into its earlier, stories. And I think I would assume, based on this quote, that she's sort of saying like, there's no like, stand up, like, here's the hero of the story kind of thing. It's, like Carter on Mars, Nick Palazzo suggests, like there's no like adventure hero per se in the story. But yeah, we've got another, 40 or 50 years worth of like tweaking the definition of hero behind that. So maybe, some of our definitions today are a little different than what she was referring to in that quote per se.
And when you do get somebody like that, like in We Can Remember It For You Wholesale, which was the influence for the movie Total Recall, it's fake. It's possibly programmed. It's possibly imagined. Right. It's fantasy, possibly.
Yeah. Well, and that's what PKD does so well, is twisting the ideas and sort of within the story retconning it, to make you question: is it drugs? Is it an android brain? Is it, something else? Is it all perception, based on what the government or corporation or whatever wants you to think? Um, so yeah, there's a lot of that.
That was one thing I really enjoyed reading it too, which they don't include in this at all, is the other bounty hunter character. Not having that element in the movie at all, kind of reading that and having it just sort of on a dime, chapter to chapter, switch back and forth. Do you think this is another replicant or not? And, honestly, I'm from chapter to chapter, my opinion is changing along with Deckard's as he's trying to figure it out. And, I think like some of those ideas of the heroism or anti-heroism of the bounty hunters and the Blade Runners, in the book, he kind of gets he gets at that through the contrast of these two characters. Whereas maybe like the film kind of puts that all into Deckard, like, the kind of cold, remorseless side of the bounty hunter becomes part of Deckard's character as well. It's the thing that he struggles with and has to overcome, rather than kind of seeing it externally in another character and being disturbed by it.
There's a line that Guillermo del Toro is used when he's talking about Shape of Water, his most recent film. It's a science fiction story set in the '60s, and won an Oscar. Long story short, he said with the film what he wanted to do is tell the same type of story you might have had in the 1960s, but make the people who would have been traditionally the heroes in that story the villains, and then the people who would have been ignored in that story, make them the heroes. And it's like the security officer in Shape of Water, kind of in the '60s, he would have been like your upstanding pillar of the town. But in that movie, he's corrupt and abusive. And I feel like Blade Runner does that in a lot of ways ahead of its time, where the authority figures are corrupt. Deckard's the cop who shoots a woman in the back, and it's the outlaws who are the sympathetic characters at the end of the day.
And some of that too is just genius casting as well. Like, I mean, we talked about Rutger Hauer, and I love Daryl Hannah in this movie. She's so good. Like every time I watch it, I'm just like, I think she's just the best.
Yeah, Rutger Hauer insisted on playing his version of a replicant as somebody who would recite poetry, have smirk, and it just it's very easy to imagine this film going a very different way with different actors.
Having just spent a fair amount of time working through Buffy on our podcast with Curtis, there's a lot of Spike in Roy, I think. This is a real influence on that character, I think. I mean, visually, obviously, but also just like the spouting of poetry, good or bad, and the kind of, higher aspirations to sensitivity and humanity, and, his kind of philosophical leanings.
All right. Anything else about the replicants themselves? And there, I was looking for that shot with the dove and the nail cat mentioned there, and sort of the. I thought we had that in there. So anything else about?
There's another on one of the slides. We have a shot of him sitting there, kind of cross-legged in his little like Buddhist pose as well. So
yeah.
Oh, Chris, I think we lost your audio.
Yep, there we go. I really like the shot of Daryl Hannah too, because she's in among these dolls, and there's just no other word for them. Even though some of them are animatronic, they're nothing as sophisticated as a replicant. And here she is surrounded by what should be, the things that are most like her, and she's just unlike any of them at all. She just can't hide, I don't know, her passion or her life or whatever. When Deckard comes through the apartment looking for the replicants, he can go right to her. So she should be this doll, but she's more alive.
And sure, can I just say too, given when we're on the scene, one of the things Ridley Scott does is exceptionally well in this movie is he just throws in a bunch of weird details in the background, no explanation, no context. Like why does Sebastian have a little teddy bear doll that walks around? Like, why did he make that? It just seemed, it's such a weird thing, but it adds so much flavor to the movie. It hints at a backstory to Sebastian. There's also a little scene that, like, when Deckard is chasing Zora, he runs close to a taxi cab, and then the camera shows us the woman inside the cab, and she's looking at Deckard, and the camera just stays there for like a millisecond longer than it should in any other movie. But it creates, there are these little moments that are not necessary to the story, but create almost a sense of unease or disorientation. Like, why, is that woman important? Who are these dolls? And it's something that I really, even Blade Runner 2049, which I think is an amazing film, I don't think quite captured this sense of weirdness and disorientation.
Sure. And actually, I hadn't thought about that, but that's an interesting thought when you bring in the idea of empathy, of just sort of a random passerby or someone diegetically watching the scenes unfolding within the world of, because Deckard he's not a cop, right? I mean, he's hired by the police, but he's not a cop. And he doesn't ever, like, that I remember, he doesn't announce himself. Like, he doesn't say, like, stop, police or anything, right? Like, it's just a man chasing a woman down the street and then shooting her in the back. Like, right. Imagine, like, being that.
He's not in uniform.
Right. He's not in uniform. He's, there's no reason to think that she's an android, or a replicant or whatever. Like, so what would someone just sort of, like, if you were on that, in that taxi or something and watching the scene unfolding, like, what's this, what would you just think of, like, seeing that happen and, unfolding in front of you? Like, and I mean, I think even in the 80s, I mean, it was a while ago, but I think that would still be considered a bad thing back then to have, a guy randomly chasing and gunning someone down in the street, Especially if, sorry, I was going to say, especially if, like, replicants aren't even allowed on world. Like you get the sense that, like, this happens, but not that often. It's not like an everyday occurrence where you're hunting down replicants in the street.
Well, and is it sort of taboo and hushed up? So do people even know that it's rare? And then is it, acknowledged when it does happen? If it's something they want to kind of keep under wraps, then kind of publicly murdering somebody is probably not great for the PR.
It's a very public, slaughter for, wanting to keep the whole thing under wraps for sure. Yeah, I don't know.
Well, this is some of what I have to say is informed by 2049, but no spoilers. My understanding is that this is a society that is there's a lot of prejudice against replicants. That they are a known entity, and that most people do not like them. They view replicants as less than human. Sure. And so I think from that context, just the gunning down is even more interesting. I mean, how many of these people, even if Deckard had announced that he was a cop and he was killing these replicants, how many people would care? I bet a lot of these people would just would be happy. Good, you got another replicant. Get the criminal, and not even think of this as a human being or as a as a sentient living organism.
Well, and that makes sense to me. What kind of, I don't want to say confusing, but sort of what makes me pause is that it's a woman just sort of watching this unfold, not knowing that it's a replicant, that thinking that it's just a guy running after a woman. Presumably, both of them are human, and there doesn't seem to be any empathy there. She's just kind of watching it, right? Like there's no horror or.
This is a
Unless
pretty
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, that's fine. This is a pretty grimy city. It's, kind of the modern version, postmodern version of Westeros. Anybody can get killed at any time, and you just sort of live with it. You've got.
It's good to know that Tyrells make it all this way.
Tyrells make it all the way.
Still in power.
But you've got Harrison Ford sitting in his car too long in an alley, and a gang of hubcap thieves or whatever it is that they're stealing, are crawling up on his car because he's just sitting there too long. There's like no expectation that you're safe in this town.
Right. Is there just maybe that's the only thing that can explain the kind of non-reaction of the people on the street, is that replicant or not, there's just the assumption that if she's getting gunned down, she must have done something to deserve it. She's running from something.
She had it coming.
Just stay out of the way is sort of, your best kind of policy to not getting got yourself.
Yeah, and in this, Rachael kind of holds herself as the only character who really holds herself above any of that griminess. He calls her on the video phone, a really cool video phone, and says, "Hey, come on down. Taffy's buying the drinks." And she's like, that's not my scene, but you have fun.
I really love your willingness to assume that these people believe Deckard is a cop and doing this under the under the aegis of the law. But unfortunately, even in our world, if we can find YouTube videos of people just standing around watching someone get murdered, taking cell phone videos even of a murder. I mean, I've read about these cases in some of my work. It's like this happens in real life.
Right.
No reason I think these people are cops or that they're doing. Just it's somewhat shocking sometimes, the ability of people to just say, I'm watching something, I'm not involved, therefore I'm an innocent bystander with no greater moral obligation to intervene or to call the authorities or to do anything. And it almost ties back to that the visual of the eye, as the eye can be powerful when it watches everything, but it also can be impotent if it's just watching and not acting.
Mm-hmm.
Even if somebody feels empathy in their heart, if they don't act on that, if all they're doing is watching, it's almost worthless.
Well, right, and that's kind of what I was trying to get at by saying, like, she must have done something to deserve what she's getting, not necessarily from like an actual legal standpoint, but just the assumption that there's something going on here that I'm not involved in, I don't understand, I don't want to know. And so the choice to just let it unfold and not get yourself involved, whether they assume that he's, an authority figure or not. At the end of the day, nobody does anything. And when you were describing that, Dom, that it reminded me of the Black Mirror episode White Bear. Has anybody seen that?
Yeah.
That I feel like that kind of gets it. It's a similar thing of being, a voyeur of something kind of horrific, and that just being, getting at the kind of horror of that. That's like one of the terrifying things I've ever seen. So if you want to be scared, go watch White Bear. The other thing with Pris here that I was thinking when I had the movie on again in the background today was with all these it's interesting that they make Sebastian a toy maker as well. Like he's involved in the kind of genetic engineering side of things, but also he has this house full of these mannequins and dolls and automatons and everything. Is there like, a Geppetto connection going on here? Is it the kind of puppets wanting to become human? I don't know.
Well, he's got no other friends. As you say, he plays chess with Tyrell kind of virtually, but everybody's left Earth and gone to the off-world colonies, and he has that aging issue. He ages too fast. He says he's 25 or something in the movie, and so he can't go off-world, and he's lonely. So I think this is his way of creating his own friends.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Geppetto.
It's also interesting, though, how some of the toys are deformed. That they're not. He's not just making replicants or animatronics that look like ideal versions of people. They're very odd creations, and I'm actually not sure what to do with that. I don't know if that says something about, maybe there's something about the fact that he doesn't feel as connected to humanity. He is so alone. Like he's not just making he's not like, one could imagine with his technological abilities, he would have created a really gorgeous wife and settled down with her. But that's not what he does. He creates something that's just not human, and it's a very interesting decision.
Well, and there's his own disease as well. Like there's some connection there too. His sense of whether it's perceived lack of humanity or however he would characterize that, or feeling not quite, whole or healthy himself. That sort of reflected in the friends and the toys that he makes around him.
Yeah, when Pris does come into his life, you can see that he's very nervous around her. She's very beautiful. He's saying all the time, "Oh, you're so beautiful," and I'm just so, deformed or ugly or old or whatever. Maybe he wouldn't feel comfortable around making I'm thinking of a Buffy the Vampire Slayer episode where he makes the robot girlfriend. Maybe he wouldn't feel comfortable with a beautiful robot girlfriend.
Maybe he doesn't feel worthy of it. This is a society that told him he's less than human. Maybe he's internalized that.
Yeah, absolutely. You want to go hang out on the island of misfit toys if you're a misfit toy.
What about the change from it being Isidore is kind of the analog in the book. His, this idea of in the book they call them like chicken heads, like this idea that the nuclear toxic dust has, affected his intellectual capacity in some way. We never quite find out exactly what's wrong with him, but at least so they say. He's, become sort of subhuman and his, in his brain or something. And here, it's this, what does he call it? Methuselah disease or something. It's like he ages at a faster rate than normal. Which kind of connects him to, maybe that's one reason for the change. It's sort of, he's paralleled to the replicants who only live for 4 years, right? So he's sort of, can again empathize with them because of a similar sense of imminent mortality. But is there other reasons for the change, do you think, or do you prefer one or the other, or kind of, I guess it's a visual thing as well. You kind of have him with his kind of wrinkled before his time, it's something you can see rather than the chicken head thing is a little more abstract, I guess.
Well, if he's a chicken head, they would have no reason to seek him out. And in the movie, the reason that they come to him is that they think he can get them to Tyrell. So he's got to be a brilliant, programmer or whatever. So I think they couldn't really do the chicken head thing in the movie that way.
Right, and that's true. In the book, they just kind of stumble across him because his apartment building that he lives in alone is way outside of the city in the suburbs where everybody's sort of fled and he's the only one left. Whereas here, that sense of he's alone in a crowd, like, yes, he has an apartment building to himself, but it's right smack in the middle of the city. And and he's their link to the Tyrell Corporation. So that makes sense.
Yeah, I really like both. I like both versions. I probably like the movie version a bit more. I partly because that parallel with the accelerated aging. I think it's really fascinating. And I don't, it's somewhat troubling though too if it's implying that the reason why Sebastian is able to feel empathy towards Pris, to be able to engage with them as basically human beings, is because of that commonality, because of that shared accelerated decrepitude, that shared flaw. And if that's the case, what does that say about the rest of us, or people who don't have that fatal flaw? Is it that we need to suffer in the same way as the other person does in order to empathize with them, or can we get beyond that? And that's where the ending with Deckard maybe gives us some hope, and that Deckard is finally able to get beyond. He doesn't have to have the same disease, and other than Sebastian, there's really nobody else in this movie who shows any empathy at all. I mean, the human characters who shows any empathy.
Well, and it's really just a difference of degree, right? Because yes, Sebastian can relate in that his life is literally being cut short. But I think the point of the quote at the end about it's, or this one that we have on the slide here, that it's a shame she won't live, but then again, who does? Like, I can't relate to what it feels like to know I'm going to die in 4 years, but I can relate to the idea of, death, full stop, that eventually, whether in 4 years or 40, death comes for us all. And that is a universal experience, it seems, between the humans and the replicants and the animals. So it shouldn't just be whose experience can you directly relate to and that it's most close to yourself. This is the one thing that's shared between everybody.
Yeah, that is that difference is one of the reasons why Earth has instituted this policy of banning replicants. Like, this is one of the major differences, if not the major difference, between humans and replicants. And it's enough. Just to clarify, replicants in the Blade Runner universe are not robots. They're not androids. They are biological beings. If you open them up, they pretty much look like humans. That's why Deckard has to use this empathy test, because you can't just cut one open and see if it's a replicant or not. So that you're right. Like, that difference, humans have that fear of death. It shouldn't be a big difference, but in a lot of ways, it makes a world of difference.
And that's an interesting flip from what it normally is, because I think when I think of whether they've come before this or afterward, all the things that are most similar in terms of a story like Battlestar Galactica and humans and Westworld and all the stories we have right now about, androids and things like that. It's usually that those are the immortal beings. And we're the tiny, and we kind of value our mortality as, well, that makes us human, that we face death, and you're inhuman because you're just a thing that lives forever and you can't understand that. And here it's flipped. Like, mortality is universal in this world, but if anything, it's reversed in that the replicants are the ones facing that most imminently, and they're being hunted down. So they're not even going to last 4 years. They're lucky if they're going to last 4 days, because the Blade Runner's after them. That's an interest. I hadn't really before this thought that that's the reversal of how it's normally done, which is another unusual thing about, PKD flipping your expectations of what you expect.
Well, and I agree with that. On top of that, it's the artificiality of the built-in, 4-year accelerated death, right? Like there's no reason why they should have to die in 4 years other than that's how they were programmed.
They're afraid that they'll
because
develop.
of the fear. Yeah. So, it's not even just that like, oh, they're just going to wear out in 4 years and we couldn't figure out a way to make them last longer. It's like, no, they could theoretically last a very long time, much longer than human lifespans. But because humans were afraid of them, they built in this time bomb, make it so that they can't.
They're already stronger than humans. They're more intelligent than humans. If they live longer than 4 years, their developers were afraid that they would become empathetic and emotional. And then we've just kind of programmed ourselves out of existence, or out of the chain, because there's going to be a new apex predator at that point. If we don't build in a 4-year or some kind of terminus for them, then people like Roy will come to Earth and get rid of us, because they're obviously superior to us. So, I mean, we can be all empathetic and nice to them when they've got a 4-year lifespan, but give them 100 years and there would be no humans left.
I think that's probably the logic of the Earth government at the time, and that's also, if you look at a lot of ethnic conflict around the world, in our world, they follow similar logic. Why a lot of ethnic conflict usually starts with the claim that if we let the other ethnic group keep going the way it is, they will overtake us. They're either because they're richer, or because they're more powerful, or because they're secretly stockpiling arms, and so we've got to act first and wipe them all out, or ban them. And you see a lot of ethnic conflict comes about when you have periods of demographic change, when one ethnic group population is either like suddenly increasing or decreasing relative to the other. Those are moments of tension. So yeah, like I think Chris, it sounds like this. It seems like this is a world in which the government of Earth saw the potential for conflict and is basically creating an apartheid regime, or something worse than apartheid.
Apartheid with a kill switch.
Absolutely. Yeah, and so there's the economic side of that too. So it's interesting that the Tyrell Corporation is like there's that sense of like we'll survive no matter what. Like whatever the rules are, we'll adapt and bend a few or whatever. But like clearly they're not supposed to have androids on Earth yet. Oh, replicants on Earth, but like here's one right here in the corporation. That's I think in the book it's like, oh, or I'm getting confused now. I think in the book they're like, oh no, it's you're safe when Rachael sort of learns of her androidness, and it's like, no, you're just like a sales model, so you're good. You don't have to like abide by the rules. And it's like, well, is that true? Like, I don't based on what I know of like the laws, I don't know if that's actually accurate or not. But the same idea.
They try to discredit the void comp test. When Deckard claims she's a replicant, they say, no, she's really human. Your test is just wrong.
Right. But then that doesn't, like, he figures that out, and then they're like, well, no, it's okay because she's just a sales model. She's not like an actual, free roaming android or whatever. But yeah, no. So I mean, just that idea of like kind of what you're going back to, Dom, to what you were saying of like, there's the repression of, whatever it is, keeping the, number of, a particular ethnic group or people down. But then it's also like the economic oppression, right? Of like not, like even if like there's not actually any greater numbers, it's also like, well, we can't give the ones that do exist, greater power. And sort of the way the Tyrell Corporation works in here is to do that kind of thing of like, okay, we'll just sort of adapt our business model to whatever, however we need to sort of stay in power, economically speaking. The whole, I mean, as happens with some of these movies, it's not entirely clear what sort of economic system they have. It's sort of, some kind of crony capitalist, link between government and business, and you're not quite sure how it all interplays. They don't go into a lot of detail, but you get this sense of like, okay, yeah, the government comes up with these laws to make the people safe, or at least make them feel like they're safe, and and then the businesses just sort of adapt and then grease the palms of whoever they need to grease and kind of do their own thing anyway. And as long as like nobody finds out what's going on, then they're just going to keep doing their thing and kind of being at the top of their game and consolidating their power in whatever way they can.
I'd almost put it even a bit more starkly. The government doesn't create the laws to make people feel safe. The government, I think, makes these laws banning replicants to make them feel that they're better than somebody. Because, if the people are at the bottom of the pyramid, they might feel oppressed. But if there's one group that's below them, hey, they're better than somebody else. I mean, this is, in the South, it's slavery and segregation. That this was the way that white politicians often kept segregation alive. You, the white farmer, might be suffering on your farm, but at least you're better than the African American over there who's even worse off.
Mm-hmm. I get the book and the movie confused sometimes, but in both, don't they offer anybody who will go off world a free replicant slave?
Yeah.
So hey, go off world and
your
the perfect workmate that will do all the stuff you don't want to do, and just for free for going off world. So I think what Dom says is right on target.
There are also there's been some suggestions too that the off-world colonies aren't as nice as they are made to be in the advertisements.
Sure.
So
I wouldn't doubt it.
And some of that goes into 2049, so I won't go too far into it. But there are questions as to what, like, if this is really what people would want. I think in the book it's made a bit. In the book, it's much more about escaping the effects of the World War. And that Earth is really destroyed. But I think in the movie, there are questions as to whether people really should be going off world.
Yeah, I guess that more as the book, I definitely had that impression of we need to offer some extreme incentives because otherwise you don't have the impression that this is a desirable, or, not that Earth is desirable, but that it wouldn't really be worth it to go colonize Mars unless you were sort of given this small army of slaves to do the work for you.
Yeah, we never really get to hear from humans that have been off world, do we?
No, which is sort of ominous. The fact that like the only ones that come back or you hear anything are the escaped slaves who are, doing whatever they can to get away. Like that, I don't think that's a great sign.
It reminds me of the Douglas Adams, one of the later ones in his Hitchhiker's series, where there's the planet with the 3 spaceships, and in the first spaceship are all the scientists and the leaders, and in the third spaceship are all the workers, and in the middle spaceship are like the marketers and the real estate agents and the lawyers, and they shoot that ship off first, and they say, "We're right behind you. We'll be right there," and they just kind of shoot them off into space, and that was a great way to get rid of all the people they didn't want from their planet. Maybe this is the way the Blade Runner governments get rid of people that they don't want from their planet? I don't know. I have no insight into that.
Well, I'd also point out that if the Roy Batty, so when Bryant is going over the replicant files, Roy Batty is a soldier model, and Pris is a pleasure model, a sex slave essentially. Neither of which indicates that these off-world colonies are paradise. If you basically have a combat model, that means there's got to be some fighting over there, and some war. Again, nothing hinted about that in the movie. Just the fact that you need combat model replicants though is ominous. And
and
again, pleasure model replicants, like why? It doesn't suggest that people are happily using Match.com in the off-world colonies and settling down into loving family relationships.
Well, and isn't Zora like an assassin model or something? Don't they use that word? Like that can't be good. Like not even combat. Like combat even sounds like one thing, but assassin is like, who are you? Who are they targeting? Have targeted killing against? Like, why would you need this model?
Well, and the opening text of the movie, isn't it like there was like an uprising or something, which is like what brought around the whole 4-year limit and all of that too. So it's like not only do you have like these combat models and assassins and all of these things, but like you can't keep control of them either. Like they might be slaves, but they're not obedient slaves apparently.
David Urbach suggests that the famous line about the attack of the ships on fire off the shoulder of Orion being another reference to off-world fighting as well. And if it's the Orion constellation, like how far are they going? Like I think in the book they mostly just talk about Mars, but there's this idea that like they've spread out over great distances.
Well, if it's human beings running these colonies, they already messed up Earth. We don't have a great track record of not messing things up.
Right.
Well, and given how much of it is propaganda versus, that's kind of like the whole thing with Philip K. Dick, right? Like you don't know like how much is real and how much is perception and propaganda or disinformation or that kind of thing. So there's a very real chance that is all the fighting amongst humans? Are they fighting other people? Is half of what they're doing like not even happening at all? Who knows like what's really going
on? Sharon has a comment about them not allowing Sebastian off-world. So there's some sort of criteria for who gets to go. And she says if they were trying to get rid of humans by sending them off-world, they would have sent Sebastian. But I feel like it's about, we want the right people to go, right? Like this is again back into forcing people into these classes and categorizations and everything, that we want to incentivize the right type of people. Because if Sebastians go and populate the stars, that's not what we want. We want Sebastian to stay here on Earth, which is doomed. And so it's like the people that want to go aren't allowed, and the people that they want to go have to be coerced and bribed and given lots of treats. That's the way I read it anyway.
Did you guys notice how many little people they had in this movie? This time it really struck me that like the gang that attacks Deckard's car has little people in it. You see them.
Right. The toys too.
Like the toys, but just people walking on the street. So maybe they just really want the big soldier type humans too to go fight their colony in the stars. Must be this tall to get on this ride,
Exit Earth.
to exit Earth. Well, what do we have left?
Yeah. So
Well, we had I don't know if you'd want to get into the identity question. This
Yeah,
was
Dom,
something
do you want to say something about your paper?
Yeah, so I'm working on a paper comparing identity in Blade Runner and Blade Runner 2049. I won't talk about 2049 tonight, so no spoilers. But the central argument is I take a debate in the political science literature about ethnic identity, and long story short, there's this, in what it is typically seen as an older view in political science, that ethnic identity is something that's intrinsic to who you are as a person. It doesn't change. It's primordial. It's like something that's, so like if you are, um, like German or Italian, Catholic, or like your ethnic identity is set. Whereas there's a more recent view that posits that your ethnic identity is socially constructed, that it's not set, that it can change over time, that it depends on your context. So, I happen to be Italian American, but I, like, when I'm filling out census forms for the U.S. government or other government paperwork, I am white or Caucasian because that's the box that they have. If I go to Italy, everyone's Italian there. I would say my family's from Naples. So like my identity depends on who I'm talking to. And in the paper, at least for the first Blade Runner movie, I argue that it's a really good example of constructivism, at least that kind of pure extreme form of constructivism where the difference, aside from the accelerated aging thing, which, as we said, is really an artificial constraint imposed by the programmers and not anything intrinsic to who the replicants are. Like, aside from that, the replicants are identified as replicants because society passed a law saying that these are replicants and that if they come to Earth, they should be killed. But there's nothing intrinsic to that. And throughout the course of the movie, we see the replicant. I think, as the viewer, we start identifying the replicants as more and more human, and that's what Deckard concludes by the end of the movie with Roy Batty, that this is a human. So the identity of the replicant characters changes based on how other people treat them.
Well, that makes me think of things in the movie and the book about this idea of passing as well. Like, that how much of there's no real biological, like you said, these are they're not robots. There's no biological difference between these types of people. So their differences are culturally imposed. I mean, I guess they were made, not born. There might be certain things you could point to as having actual different experiences, but mostly these are sort of identities that are constructed, like you said.
Yeah, and just to clarify, the constructive approach to identity isn't that biology doesn't matter, like we're race blind. It's more how we interpret that biology and the context in which we interpret it. So yeah, like there might be a biological difference, like the lifespan, like being born, but those are not necessarily determinative in determining if a being is a human. That line depends on how our society views humanity.
Right, and not determinative of what kind of person you are, what your choices are, what your beliefs are, how you relate to your fellows and the world around you. Those are not, like, as we said, we can find examples of how those don't fall along the lines that socially we're told that they will, that humans act this way and replicants act this way. that doesn't seem to be the case in how the story actually plays out.
Yeah, and in terms of the biology, again, going back to Sebastian, well, the point you were making before, Sebastian, like the replicants, is going to die young. He has accelerated decrepitude, yet I guarantee nobody watching the movie ever thinks, oh, because of that biological difference, he is a replicant. No, and we all classify him as human because that's what society tells us to do.
And we have the right to shoot him on the street because he's not like us. Yeah, it's interesting. I'm looking here at Rutger Hauer with his shirt off, and I'm thinking, I bet he has a belly button. Like, who gave the replicants belly buttons? That has to be. Wouldn't you do something to make them more recognizable if they're so horrible to have on Earth, and you need to be able to distinguish them from humans? Why did we, who created them, make it so hard to distinguish them from humans? We could have, made some change to their biology or something. I don't know. But
does that get back to why, for reasons of their own, the Tyrell Corps isn't necessarily doing the thing that the police or the government or the people would, like, there's this sense of, like with the Voight test and everything, they're always trying to stay one step ahead of detection. For whatever reason, I don't know. Does that make them more marketable as slave labor? I'm not sure what's their sort of business motivation for that, but it seems like their goal is to make them as indistinguishable as possible. And every time there's a new development of an empathy test, well, we make a better model of Android and stay just that much ahead of it.
Yeah, maybe it's like an uncanny valley thing. Like, you have to get through that to a point where people are going to actually accept them as not having a belly button is just too weird. So they give them belly buttons.
The no belly button model didn't sell. That didn't test well with the focus group.
The Nexus 5, didn't have that. It wasn't as good. Well, yeah. Anyway, sorry.
If you are a replicant, and I'm thinking about what your identity is, Roy says to be a slave is to live in fear. And so I think that their ethnic identity is slave. And that certainly separates them from humans. Deckard doesn't know what it's like to die until he's hanging off of that building. That would be interesting to interrogate that a little bit more. Good paper, Dom. I want to read it.
Thanks.
Sharon says the company slogan is more human than human. So this is their business model. That's what they are giving, the service that they're providing for the people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, other sci-fi stories have done, had similar, like Westworld, Humans, the TV show, a lot of Battlestar Galactica, and a lot of these shows, when they have human-like robots, they look pretty indistinguishable from humans. I'm trying to think of one off the top of my head that is human-looking but clearly not human. In Battlestar Galactica, they had, like, for one episode, they had the Cylons' spines light up when they were having sex for some reason, and that they never carried that forward. So I wouldn't even count that as a biological difference. But yeah, most of the times they're human, and I think that's obviously there are some non-diegetic reasons for that. Like, if you're doing a story about humanity, it makes more sense to have a being that looks human. But I also wonder if that's because we value humanity, and if we're going to have somebody do our labor, especially going back to what we were talking about before about how sometimes one of the incentives to having your replicant slave might be that feeling of power. Well, you probably wouldn't have that feeling of power. you don't have a feeling of power over your Roomba or your vacuum because they're not human. They don't look
Right.
sentient. They don't look anything like us. But you can get that power trip by lording over something that's human, and that might be part of the appeal too.
Data from Star Trek would be the only one I could think of that
Oh,
was
yeah.
like
Of course, yeah, Data.
almost human, but not, like
Yes, recognizably.
Clearly not.
recognizably not
Yeah.
through mannerism and somewhat through look.
Yeah.
Maybe,
There was a show with Carl Urban. It only lasted half a season, I think, called Almost Human. And I think he was a cop
Yeah.
and he had a partner that I think might have had a few exposed circuits or something. Otherwise, he looked human. I'd have to go back and watch that again.
I think it doesn't go too far, but that show Humans on like the BBC show, I think that skews more robot-y looking than some of them. Like they're not naturalistic in their movement, and they have the eyes, which some of them can wear the contacts, but like the sheen of the skin and
Yeah, that's true.
like there's a few of them that are pretty close, but like I feel like they try to make their android robots look a little more robotic than some of these other examples.
But there are robots on that show, or whatever they are, that pass as human. There's the
Yes.
There's the one. I don't want to give spoilers away if you're going to go run out and watch that show now. But there's one that you think is human for the whole first season, and then
Right, but they're like the exception. There's like a few of them, but the other ones are a little more like you kind of get the sense that by and large they're a little more distinguishable. But then there's this fear that they're going to start to become a little more naturalistic and start to infiltrate.
Xenia suggests the Doctor on Voyager. I'm not as familiar with Voyager, so I don't know
Robert
what that
Picardo.
is.
The hologram.
Yeah, the hologram. Yeah. That's a good one. So the Deckard-Rachael relationship.
Yes.
I mean, is that him just wanting to have power over?
In light of the discussion we just had, I think you definitely have to consider that point of view. Yeah.
Right.
Well, and I mean, every relationship with her, right? Because I mean, the Tyrell Corporation, like, that's what. I mean, she doesn't necessarily know it initially, but then
she's owned. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like sorry, I'm blanking on the guy's name there, the senior Tyrell.
And Tyrell.
Mr.
Yeah.
Tyrell.
I mean, like when he suggests, like, oh, she's starting to guess and that kind of thing. I mean, she questions her whole relationship there. But what's interesting then, I think that Deckard's, motivation could certainly be, one of dominance or whatever there. But what's her motivation?
Survival.
Sure. But she leaves and kind of goes out on her own, right? So like, and hangs up on him on like video phone and stuff. That's true. So like, she could presume like if she left Earth, then she would be totally fine, presumably, right? So what if she just continued to pass as a human long enough to just get off of Earth, and then she's not breaking any laws, presumably?
Good point.
I've always gotten the sense with that scene that it's almost like I almost get the sense that it's two people who have never been in a romantic relationship and don't know how to show tenderness, like really badly fumbling their way through. It's almost like they don't know how to do this. They don't know. Rachael has never had this experience before. Like, what is her role? What is she supposed to be doing? Like, what is, is she supposed to say, I love you? Like, is she, or in Deckard probably has never been in a tender relationship either. The voiceover says he was married, but we get the sense that was a very bad marriage. So it's like, I think there's kind of this dominance there, but like a lot of abusers, I have to wonder if that's maybe because he was in a he was abused himself, or he he has felt like he has been the oppressed, and his way of reacting against that is to think, oh, the way to have a relationship is to be the oppressor, to be the dominant one. And that's where, by the end of the movie, he changes.
That's pretty typical. Abused children grow up to be abusers in a lot of cases. I put this picture of Joan Crawford in the corner stylistically to show how Rachel's hair and the big shoulder pads and everything came from this Joan Crawford. This is in Mildred Pierce, which is a book and a movie and a TV show later with the
Kate
Titanic
Winslet.
girl. Yeah, Kate Winslet. About a self-made woman. And I thought that was really interesting. That is Rachel, the ultimate self-made woman. Once she realizes what she is, she leaves Tyrell. She goes out on her own. And basically creates this relationship of some sort with somebody who can get her out of her situation. I don't know. I thought it was interesting. I don't know if I really have any answers, but I wonder why they picked the Joan Crawford look, except that it's fierce.
Sure.
But I wonder if there's
and I think it draws from the kind of 1940s noir aesthetic that's kind of, I mean, there may be deeper reasons than that as well, but
yeah, I would just add to the self-made woman thing that not only I wouldn't even say that Rachel latches on to some man who's going to get her out of the situation. She's the one who saves Deckard when Leon is attempting to kill him. She kills the big bad replicant. The only replicants Deckard kills, he kills 2 women by shooting them in the back. He's not. So Rachel. I get the sense that Rachel could have tried to fend for herself, but for the fact that she had no idea who she was.
Yeah. Sharon says she thought that Rachel was in danger even off planet because she didn't have the short life programming, and that that her design wasn't sort of permitted or allowed or whatever. And ask, is she misremembering that? I don't know if that's explicitly stated or not. I don't remember.
Debatable.
She asks, what is specifically stated is that she asks Deckard, what was in my file and was my date in my file, and Deckard says, I didn't read that part of your file. So she doesn't know.
So it's kind of left open for interpretation.
There's some 2049 stuff that might bear on this. So
okay. Well,
come back to later maybe.
So we can come back to that.
Well, I mean, if she's still around in 2049, then we know that she didn't have the 4-year programming, right?
But that might be why she sent them out, is she's hoping that he knows when her retirement date is or whatever.
Yeah. No, that's fair. And I'm not even suggesting that, like, without that there's still not reason for her. I guess I'm just, like, there seems like some incentive, at least, for her to leave the planet. But yeah, like, maybe if it's a journey of self-discovery for her and Deckard's the one I combined them there. If Deckard's the one who's gonna know, and the Game of Thrones references are like throwing me off. Anyway, if she's if he's the one who's got the information on her, then yeah, it definitely makes more sense for her to seek out. And I mean, not the first story that has sort of a, hunter versus prey sort of attraction between them, right? Like, I mean,
I think too
how realistic that is a separate issue.
I think that's kind of like a movie cliche of, again, I think it's another way of showing externally what they're trying to get across internally, of how do I convey my mixed feelings and my feeling of attraction, but also reserve, and how do we interpret that sort of so that people can see it? Well, you have her resist, and then and then you're supposed to get the idea that she actually is into him. She's just resisting. And I think it doesn't, it's a thing that movies do that I think is nowadays, I think we're very sensitive to the way that comes across that, certainly wasn't, I don't think would have read the same way in 1982. Maybe it did for some people, but,
well, so like, I think, Kat, like, I think, yeah, that's what they were going for. Although I think there's also the complication that, Harrison Ford and Sean Young, the actors involved in the scene, had issues with each other. They did not get along. So there's that dynamic as well. That, again, non-diegetic. I don't know what you want to do with that, but it is something.
Right. So does it come across even more fraught than they were intending?
I suspect so.
This was her first movie. So she didn't really she wasn't in high school plays, like nothing. So, she just had her natural talent to go on, and maybe she didn't know quite how to do subtext or subtlety. But I think that there is an argument, like which one of them is the hunter and which one is the prey. She does the perfect stuff to reel him in, hanging up on him.
And that's definitely a question, like you were saying before, like how much of her leaving with him at the end is about her getting what she needs to, be self-made, like you said, to escape her situation. Like, do we think this is a long-term, in her mind, a long-term solution, or is this this is my ticket out of here and it's going to last for as long as I need it to in order to feel like I'm free and can go off on my own?
I think it's interesting in that, and all of the major characters in Blade Runner have some sort of animal associated with them, and I won't go through them all. Like, there's theories about that you can look online. Rachael, the name Rachael in Hebrew means like ewe, like female sheep, and there are other, especially in the book, they kind of hit on that pretty heavily. That she's there's some sheep iconography associated with her, but she's also associated with the spider. There's that story she tells Deckard about how when she was younger, she saw the spider, and it's like that's a kind of, it's not all spiders are evil, not all spiders are predatory, but like the popular conception of spiders is that they are predatory, that they will try to lure somebody in the web and tangle them up. And that's a very interesting association for a character who kind of seems helpless on the surface or very confused on the surface.
And what that spider story is about is babies eating their mother, is the young eating the parent, which she doesn't kill Tyrell, but
well, if it's taken as a broader metaphor for the replicants, that's exactly what they do. The children come home and kill the parents.
She's also,
and there's Battlestar Galactica foreshadowing there.
All right. Well, we're kind of at the 2-hour mark here. And, we will have another discussion around Blade Runner 2049. So we can revisit some of this stuff as well. So, but one last question that should only take us like a minute or two to answer comes from Xenia. Do replicants have souls? No, I'm just kidding. I don't know if that's one that we can't answer. Maybe it's a good paper topic. Or maybe the next movie club we can tackle that one.
I think the bird imagery of Rutger Hauer letting go of that bird at the moment of his death leaves that as a very valid question. I don't have an answer, but I certainly think that the imagery could be read that way.
All right. Well, on that note, we're gonna close down. Thank you everyone for joining and for your comments and questions. And we'll be back in March for the Blade Runner 2049. So go out and watch that and brush up and
buy 4K TV and upgrade all your Blu-ray.
Buy 4K TV.
Yeah,
watch
instead of
everything
getting my
in
pipes fixed, I think I'll do that.
super high def.
Curtis, can I make one more quick plug?
Sure.
If you are into Blade Runner, there's a really great podcast called Shoulder of Orion where they have new episodes like every 2 weeks or so, really going in depth into Blade Runner. So if this was fun tonight, it's something you might want to check out.
There you go. All right. Well, thank you all, and we will see you next time. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks. Have a good night.